Just waiting for some attendees to come on. Yeah. I think we can go ahead and start now. Hello, everybody that's able to tune in today. My name is Herrana. I am the Advocacy Officer for Freedom United. Freedom United is the largest community dedicated to eradicating all forms of modern slavery and human trafficking. It's a pleasure to be here with Rosa for Times of Equality. Times of Equality has partnered with us with our Domestic Workers Convention and our ILO Forced Labor Protocol. So today we'll be chatting a little bit in remembrance of the International Day for Domestic Workers, which was January 16th. As we all know, domestic workers are highly vulnerable to modern slavery and exploitation. Their vulnerability is also a lot larger because a lot of women go into this industry and migrant women. So we'll be touching on the different areas and how COVID-19 has been impacting this industry as well. So Rosa, I would like to open the space for you to introduce yourselves to our audience and to give a little bit of background context of Times of Equality and some of the work that you do.
Yes, thank you very much, Herrana. Hello, everybody. We are delighted to partner with you, with Freedom United, and to have this webinar on the topic of domestic workers, which is really an important and often invisible topic. So I am the founder and the president of Time for Equality. It started in 2013 as a civil society initiative, and now it's a recognized organization, a non-profit organization in Luxembourg. Our focus is on gender equality, human rights, inclusion, and since 2017, we have been focusing mostly on human trafficking and modern slavery, especially the intersection with the increase of migration since 2015, which is creating a large pool of vulnerable people and groups. So we have been focused on these topics in the frame, of course, of gender equality and human rights and inclusion. And our main activities are, raising awareness, activities, and advocacy. So because we are, a small organization, independent, self-financed or with small, contributions, and we believe that raising awareness is the first step to change, to bring people to change, to bring about action. And so our way of functioning is to partner, to work in networking with other organizations, both at local and European level and the international level, like with you now. So we try to leverage, the strengths of different organizations, and we support actions and projects by partners, by others. So this is our... I cannot hear you.
I'm on mute.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for giving the overview. And for everybody else that's also tuning in, please feel free to drop any questions on the Facebook chat as we're streaming. And my colleague will be picking them up for a quick Q&A for after our talk. So please feel free to drop your questions if you have any for us as well. And Rosa, thank you so much for giving us an overview a little bit about the organization and the work you're doing with the focus of, human trafficking and also migrants. So as we're diving into our topic of domestic workers, as you mentioned, and we spoke a little bit earlier about how migrant workers often fall into the trap of modern slavery, and this comes in forms of also domestic workers. So from your work and also doing advocacy, what are some risks domestic workers face as they're working in different countries or being migrants as well?
Yes, as you said at the beginning, domestic work is one of the least, the least formalized kind of activity of work. And um, so there is this paradox. It's work, I mean, what is domestic work? Is work performed in one household. Either, it could be different activities, could be either, home, cleaning the home, but also taking care of children or dependent people, or other activities like, gardening, etc. But there is this paradox between the public, the aspect of work with all its formalities and rights and legal framework, and the private sphere of domestic, of home, which makes, and as you said, also the fact that the majority of domestic workers are women. Indeed, it's estimated that 83% of domestic workers are women, and most of them are migrants, immigrants. So we have already an element for undervaluation of the kind of work. Now, it's kind of work which is not valued in itself because it pertains to the private sphere, to the care work, which is often unremunerated, or when it's remunerated, it has very low wages. So we have these two elements, which are the demographic of domestic workers, mostly women, and women in a precarious situation because they're migrants or with family responsibilities, not independent financially. And there is this protection gap linked to the nature of domestic work, which makes that this area is particularly exposed to all kinds of risks. First of all, you have economic, financial precariousness. As you said, this work is not paid, even when it's, formalized. It's under the minimum wages, a little bit under the minimum wage. You don't have a full-time. Very often it's difficult to have a full-time employment. For this, you have to combine different employers sometimes. And very often you don't have social securities, even when it's formalized, when it's declared. Some countries do not give to domestic workers, paid sick leave or paid leave or maternity, all these kind of benefits. They're not part of the, so it makes, it creates a lot of vulnerabilities when there is a crisis like the COVID, where, the main message was everybody has to stay home. But if domestic workers, if you stay at home, you don't have work very often because you don't have a formal contract very often that whereby you get, replacement income for income, or rather, extra leave. So for most of domestic workers, they found themselves in a situation where either they couldn't go, out to their job, to their work, because of the lockdown, also because they were afraid of, getting, falling ill. And so they lost part of their work, they lost hours, even when they are recruited through agency. We noticed that there has been a reduction in hours because many of the clients, they didn't, they reduced, for instance, cleaners who, they said, okay, we don't need them. And so they were lost, they were left without income. And when it's not, sorry.
I just wanted to also expand on that piece about there's this legislative gap even before the pandemic started, and that would be like also my next question I wanted to ask was, how has COVID impacted domestic workers? And you've touched on it a little bit, that the systems that are already in place to protect domestic workers are very bare minimum to none in many countries. So we've seen that these structures, and what the pandemic has done is just shed a light and shown us even more of how big these gaps are. So what supports, or like what's being done for domestic workers during this pandemic, and how have countries and government agencies or even companies have been responding to protect them? Hello? I think Rosa's webinar glitched up a little bit, so we'll just wait for her to come logging on. But just to reiterate a little bit of the talking points we just spoke about, it's really important to understand what happened with the pandemic with domestic workers. Hello.
Okay, yeah,
We
we're
just
here again.
Yes, I was just mentioning how, it's really important to understand that the pandemic didn't just start this creation of abusing domestic workers or them losing work or not having protections, but it was something that's always been there, but now it's just gotten terribly worse. So it'd be great if you could expand a little bit of, what trends have you seen that has been happening within domestic workers, how countries have been responding. I know, for example, in the United States, if you don't have proper work authorization, even though if you are paying taxes, you still will not be eligible for unemployment compensation. So it makes you even more vulnerable to want to look for employment that might not be traditional or safe, and opening you up to human trafficking. So to just get a little bit of context of also from your background, what have you seen to be the trends currently?
Yeah. Yes, as you said, of course, the situation of domestic workers was already very precarious before the COVID. There have been research and studies at international level, also at European level. The Union Fundamental Rights Agency published some reports on this, explaining the situation of domestic workers in the EU, also not only from the legal point of view, but also with interviews of domestic workers. So we have a picture already of a lot of problems before, the start of the crisis. And this crisis just, revealed, as in all aspects, the inequalities of the systems. In all aspects, also, for instance, in the equality between, gender equality, women are being disadvantaged during the crisis. All the inequalities are becoming stronger. And what is it? So it already was there, the situation, and the crisis made these inequalities more visible. And we have already some estimates from the International Organization of International Labor Organization, published on the 16th of June for International Domestic Workers Day, where they estimate that at global level, 50 million of domestic workers overall in the world are, really heavily impacted by the crisis. And they made a comparison per different areas. And you have certain areas where this impact is higher, let's say 70, 75%, like in Southeast Asia, in Africa, also in the States, and in Europe, it's around 45%. It's a little bit less because you have a bigger part of formal domestic work. But the problems have been present also when domestic work is formalized, like it is the situation in Europe.
I also would love for you to expand. I know since Times for Equality is based in also in Luxembourg, what has been the trends within Europe in regards to domestic workers and the response? I know when the pandemic was launched, like when the pandemic lockdown occurred, that Spain was extending unemployment benefits only for domestic workers that do have work authorization, but as we know, many domestic workers do not have proper work authorization. They might be just coming in without like the proper paperwork, and they don't get protected. And this is a big part of the industry. So what has been the trends in the European Union and Luxembourg overall?
Yes, you know, the general impression is that the domestic workers have not received the support and the protection that they would deserve, even when they are in a formal employment situation. As you say, we have the European Union. They gave some guidelines on how to deal with the most vulnerable workers, migrant workers, but then every country is dealt, you know, autonomously. And in general, I'd say that governments, I mean, they failed to address the problem. Domestic workers, as other, you know, kind of vulnerable workers, they were already invisible or made invisible. They were even more invisible. And I will give you an example. Of course, for domestic work, you have part of people who are formally employed, declared, let's say, but you have a large gray area of undeclared work, you know. So that in that case, you cannot do anything, of course. But you can imagine that there are people who okay. So even in the case of formal employment, what the government decided was to give unemployment benefits to the people who were employed in agencies, through companies, but not to the private, to the person, to the household who were employing, you know, declared a domestic worker, because they were private. So it was up to their goodwill, because they have a good relation with the domestic worker, etc. So as you see, the link, the low status, the lack of understanding of value given to domestic work already starts at this stage, where you say, you know, if you work for a private household, then maybe it's not real work. And the private employer is not a real employer. This is the message you give, you know, because it's not entitled. So of course there are employers who decided to give, you know, paid leave to the domestic workers, because they, you know, had a sort of they were aware of this responsibility, but others didn't. So but you know, for me, it's amazing, because it would have involved really a little part, you know. It's 6,000 working for private households. For small, you know, they have not full-time job, so the money would have been really not a big deal. But it's the philosophy behind, you know. And this is a difficulty, I think, in making domestic work recognized as, I say, you know, real work, like all other, you know, kind of activities. For me, this was, you know, revealing, eye-opener. And I understand that also in other countries, for instance, in Portugal, they were one of the first countries to give, you know, the possibility for migrant undocumented workers, you know, to be regularized. I don't know if it's the right word. But yesterday I watched a video, there was a discussion in the parliament, and a member of parliament, on the occasion of International Domestic Work Days, he was really complaining about this, that domestic workers had been left aside, so they didn't receive any, you know, income, etc., to supplement the loss of livelihood that they had. So it was the same situation. as in Luxembourg, and I understand also in other countries. But what I noticed, it's important that at least there was a debate in the parliament on this topic.
Yeah. It's
Portugal.
still being brought up. It's something that's on the agenda for it to
Yeah.
be, and that's why it's important to have, you know, conversations like these, to have organizations like Times for Equality and Freedom United, where people are calling on these governments, because if we don't hold individuals accountable, it will be oftentimes forgotten, and we need to make sure that, you know, topics like these are being put on the agenda item, and we're actually responding to them, and they're not just talking points that, you know, people will just bring up for International Day of Domestic Workers, and then we forget about them. And one thing that you've mentioned that I think is really important to highlight is what framing that all work is real work, and not just prioritizing work that is coming into, you know, the blue collar, like going into the office. That's oftentimes who we categorize as individuals when we're thinking about who are workers. And then oftentimes individuals who are working in these industries are oftentimes forgotten in construction. And you could just see the correlation, and also the systematic structures of like oppression that's already in there in regards to access to education for them to be in those positions, migrant status, and like privileges that comes with that. So it's all intertwined on who gets to have those privileges of being protected.
Yeah.
So to dive in a little bit more on that, why is it important for us, you know, to support legislation like the Domestic Workers Convention with the ILO and the Forced Labor Protocol? I know we're partnering on both of those campaigns that we're pushing more countries to ratify, but what has this pandemic shown us in a sense of why are these protocols and these conventions important, and why do we need them?
Yes, absolutely. We believed, yeah, even before the crisis, of course, in the importance of these legal, international legal instruments. Why? Because, for instance, for the Domestic Workers Convention, it's true that there are laws. Every country have this sort of laws. It's not that, and there are conventions for, legal framework for domestic workers. So law are not everything, because then you must have the implementation, etc. So you don't solve problems only with laws. But what is the message with the convention, ILO convention on domestic workers? First of all, you have to realize that you put the spotlight on one of the, is a kind of work which is the most invisible, undervalued, underestimated. We didn't mention all the other risks for domestic workers of, bullying, racism, violence, and, some cases you have real example of domestic servitude. We had also examples in Luxembourg. We have, there are cases of trafficking and for work exploitation, and one of the risk sector is indeed domestic workers. So for me, first of all, it's so important that there has been a convention which has been the, how to say, the culmination, the adoption of these conventions of a process where you had governments, you had employers, and you had trade unions, and you had also workers' organization. There's been an incredible activity of workers' organization, of domestic workers, to achieve this, and so it was, it's, fantastic for me that you have a document which is an agreement between the three, involved parties, not something that comes from top down. You have, I read a lot of the movements who contributed to this convention, of domestic workers organization in different countries. So it's already, an important message to have this, and also shows them, it gives a certain framework, clarity.
Yeah.
Why? I give you an example. The other day, I see an ad on Facebook on a group there was someone who was looking for a nanny. And he said, you know, we are looking for one person with the times, etc., and the tasks, very unclear, because this person had to take care of children, then to prepare dinner, you know, it was already very unclear. And the only remuneration, compensation, was a flat, to have a flat. Okay, so there were reaction in this conversation. People say, sorry, is there no money? No, because you have a flat, you know. You can say, yes, but you cannot eat the flat, you know, you don't have. But the person was convinced that, you know, you could have a nanny, so someone who has a lot of responsibility because has to take care of your children for no money or for no, you know, so it's something that is thought possible, whereas so we don't have to look at other countries far away where you have really, you know, excessive cases of exploitation. The mentality is often that, okay, I give you something, I give you meals or a room, and then you do the work. And then you know how it is when you are in a relation, in a household, in a family, you have not the same relation that with a formal employer.
Yeah.
You are you know, part of the family, but not real, you know. So the convention gives at least some minimum standards for, you know, wages.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be, you know, inferior. When there is in-kind payment, you have to specify it. Possibility to complain, you know, to organize, to have your medication. So it gives all this that it's a learning process also for the society, because I tell you, even, you know, in advanced democracy like Luxembourg, France, Italy, you think that you can have someone working in your home for, I don't know, 18 hours a day for nothing.
And that's the whole point of, you know, speaking about this, is modern slavery exists everywhere. It's not something that happens, you know, in this country or where they have a lot of obstacles and excessive exploitation, but it could happen anywhere, and nobody is excluded from that category of not having modern slavery. So one thing that I've noticed is, even working in this space and pushing for more ratifications, is, you know, some countries might think, or like agencies will be like, you know, our country doesn't have this problem, we already have great legislation, like we don't need it. But what we've noticed is, in countries who have these like conventions and legislative guards, have had a better response to the pandemic because they were better prepared than countries that didn't have it. So it just shows you how important it is to have it. And one thing that you mentioned that's really important is having the Domestic Workers Convention builds a structure. It's not a solution to eradicating the issue of domestic servitude. However, it gives the building block for governments to at least utilize to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And like, as you mentioned, the implementation is the other part. So once a country has ratified, it needs to be taken in on how it's being implemented. And, you know, civil society and people from the ground up need to be there to also hold it forward. So it's one piece of the puzzle, but does not fix the whole solution, which is really important to highlight. And it also gives, how you mentioned earlier with domestic workers, it's not oftentimes formalized because it's such a personal occupation, especially if you're working inside a home and you're meeting family members, taking care of somebody's child. That's a very intimate workspace. So oftentimes it's not formalized or structured how we would imagine when you're going into office and you have an HR, or you could have like it's a different type of work, but it does not mean that it shouldn't be protected, how you've mentioned as well. So as we're wrapping up a little bit of our chat, I wanted to see what could the public do to demand for better protections in domestic workers? For our audience who are here today, from Times of Equality, what could they do to help support your work and also to push forward this eradication for domestic servitude?
Yeah, indeed, I think the civil society has an important role. And first of all, I think the first thing to do is to listen to the voices of the person concerned, really to make an opinion your opinion, or I mean, on the basis of what, domestic workers, people experience in their life. So that should be our first reflex, because now I'm talking from my point of view, of course, and I've no direct experience of domestic work, and it's true that sometimes it's good to give or to use your platform to, but also try to put your platform at the service of them, to give them voice. So this is what we are reflecting more and more. And recently, where we organized a series of events this year on the theme of care work in general, and we focus on domestic work as time for equality. And there were testimonies of women of migrant origin who gave the point of view on being considered domestic workers, the worker of their life. And also the voice of, we had a very touching testimony of a daughter of one of these her mother was a cleaning lady all her life, and she had interiorized the stereotype, that her mother had no value because what is, it's not a job. And then she realized, when she was an adult, that how important, how strong she was, etc. So we have to listen more to these stories and to the perspective. And
Rosa, your screen cracked a little bit. We'll just wait for her to jump on.
Only talking about, the...
Could you cut off a little bit?
Sorry.
We lost you.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So I don't know where I was cut, at what point. Oh, it's unstable again.
Yeah.
My connection.
Now it's working fine. I mean, it wouldn't be a good webinar if we didn't have some hiccups on the streaming.
But I mean, to try to have open discussion, like, in parliaments on this topic, because it's important to talk about it. It's, like I heard it was in the Portuguese parliament. I thought it was a good thing to do.
Yeah.
I would like to have this debate also in other countries, also in Luxembourg, or not only talking about business, big companies, and etc.
Yeah.
And then to work, to outreach communities, to do community work, to organize, to, as you said, to raise awareness and to stimulate reflection. Because also talking, for instance, with the friends of colleagues, you realize sometimes, that people sometimes they don't think about it. They don't think that they are exploiting someone if they don't declare. Then there is this sort of eye opener that so this kind of work, organize an action and in a neighborhood or in a company, to raise attention.
Mm-hmm. And one other way also with Freedom United is we do have our petition, which we've also dropped in our chat, and we could also share the Domestic Workers Convention, where you can sign our petition, and we'll be utilizing that to make sure that Domestic Workers Convention is being pushed on different legislative parliament debates, as Rosa has mentioned as well, and utilizing everybody's voice to put on pressure. So that's another way that we're also able to mobilize, and for those who are also attending this webinar. And one thing that I also wanted to flag, I had on my notes to speak about, is also understanding, the different vulnerabilities that play for domestic workers, especially for those who are migrants and people of color, especially. I know for myself, I'm Ethiopian. There's a lot of domestic workers that flow out of Ethiopia and go into other countries for work. And not only are they met for the stigma that they're facing for being migrants, but also the connotation of being, a certain color and a certain race. And it's very important to highlight that, especially with how things have been going and the issues here that we've seen, that race plays a big factor in these discriminations and
Yeah.
employment. I know there was a lot of reports in a couple of years back where there were some women of color, like African migrants, who are being found abused, and horrible violations of human rights that are happening. And it makes you also see that this is a workers, also workers and vulnerability of migrants, but it also touches on the aspect that minority migrants who are traditionally racially discriminated are at most of the time, not always, having to face multiple oppressions within their employers when they're going there as well.
Yeah. Yes,
But
absolutely. As you said, yeah, we said at the beginning, the fact that there are so many women and women with a migrant background and with different, yeah, and we know that there is a lot of, yeah, yeah, racism is
yeah,
absolutely. That's why
intersectionality.
you have, voila, is exactly to approach the really in an intersectional way. This.
Yeah,
And it's always like in trafficking, in modern slavery, it's a matter of power relations, of man, and then you replicate, duplicate the power relations in different,
yeah, understand.
ways.
Yeah,
Like, in gender, it's the fact that women earn less, they're not financially independent, you know, is one
yeah,
of the elements that can, um, of this, of women discrimination,
yeah,
and the fact that they are more subject to violence, domestic violence, they cannot live because they don't have independence, etc.
yeah,
And for domestic workers, then we didn't mention the fact that when they live with the employer, sometimes is yeah, it's even more difficult
yeah,
at a distance. And I was talking with a colleague from working in an association that provides assistance to women victim of violence, of trafficking, etc. And they said, how is I mean, do you have more cases now, more requests? Because with the pandemic, we heard that in certain countries, especially, there's been an increase in domestic violence and in abuse. And in Luxembourg, not, you don't have it. So she said, not really, but because you are in the same, if you are in the same home with the abuser, you are not free even to go and to look for, so the lockdown has made this more difficult. As
yes, the escape, yes. Well, thank you so much, Rosa, for having this webinar with us and discussing. I will now switch over to our Q&A section to see if any of our audiences have any questions for us. I will switch this over to my colleague, Alan, who will be asking us from the Facebook chat.
Hello, thank you for both of your insights into the issue. We've got a few different questions, so I'm just going to put them out to both of you. Whoever feels they want to answer, yeah, you can begin. I'm going to start with a question which you sort of touched on towards the end, which is very much covered in the news at the moment, which is, what role do you think systematic racism plays in abuse of domestic workers? And do you think they need to work together and to tackle both issues in order to promote the urgency of this in a particular climate?
So just to jump in on that, and it's something that's always been relevant. One thing that we've learned in 2020 that I always say is, we've always had these issues, but now it's gotten so big for anybody to ignore. So in regards to domestic workers and the structure of racial oppression that comes with it has always been present. As we mentioned earlier, for migrants who are, any migrant actually already has this connotation and the stigma against when you're going into different countries, but it is, you have more of a barrier when you are an individual of color, especially if you're a Black individual. I could even share this from my experience of even coming into the United States. Not only did I always have to adjust of, the understanding how gender plays a role in my identity, but also being an immigrant and also being Black, it's all compiled and it lives through you, and you can't let go of one identity to compensate for the other one. So with the domestic workers angle, totally, that there's been a lot of research and reports that are coming out that we have seen also within the Middle East, where a lot of African women go into the Middle East to do work, but you see them oftentimes, there's even been reports of murder that's happening with employers. So the structure of racism when it comes to modern slavery and human trafficking is ingrained and embedded. I mean, even the word slavery, we understand the history that comes with it. So it would be really hard to differentiate and not to tackle racism while we're working on modern slavery, because it is very, very much intertwined into the structure of creating modern slavery. One thing that we're hoping, and I'm hoping in the advocacy work and the anti-slavery movement, is using race as a pillar to do research and to assess vulnerabilities. Oftentimes when we look at human trafficking, we see, their migration status, gender, sexuality, and disabilities, but oftentimes race is tabled or just thrown in there as an analysis at the end. But what we need to do is, when we're assessing risks, we need to look, how's this individual's immigration or legal status affecting them, how's their gender, but how's also race playing a factor, and then we could better streamline how we could tackle the systematic racism that's instilled also in human trafficking and modern slavery. Rosa, I'm not sure if you wanted to chime in a little bit more on that.
I would like to add the European angle, because the Fundamental Rights Agency that I mentioned before, about the study they made on labor exploitation, they made also some studies on being Black in different countries of Europe, and one of the countries was Luxembourg. So they interviewed a group of people, etc., and in the series of countries that, there were 6 countries, where they had this focus, Luxembourg was one of the worst scores. And that was a shock for Luxembourg, for the, let's say, the establishment, the government, the society, because I said, are we racist? And then you hear the voice of our Black, people, citizens here in Luxembourg, and they had a lot of, they recognized their experience in their stories, and we started to listen to their stories. So it was, as I said, an eye opener. This it was just the beginning, and there was a lot of, they couldn't believe that the study was real, So it's a process, just to say how these prejudices are so strong, so ingrained, that you think that everything is going well only because you are not in the same situation. But then when we talk with the people, so it was really a shock for the country. There's been a lot of discussion also in the press, and now there are a few association or movements of Afro descendant, especially women, but also mixed, who are becoming more vocal, because they say, no, this is true, so it's coming to the surface, but it has been removed, like, no, this doesn't exist here in Luxembourg, but also in Italy. You think that they're not racist, and then you hear the testimonies of Italian who are second generation, like in Luxembourg, Black, and they are, considered as they are discriminated. So absolutely, I think it's a really very visible element of diversity. So yeah, you can hide certain things, but it's very visible. And I think that we have to work with this, our own prejudice as society, because we don't want to see the racism which is in our society. So that's why I was saying we have to listen more to the voices. And this is what we are doing now, especially in Luxembourg, with giving voices to the experiences of Black women, Black men, Black young people, who tell a completely different story that we didn't think about it. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a few more questions I'm going to try and get through. One question was from George through Facebook, speaking about, are legal protections robust enough to deter further abuse, or do other support systems need to be working in tangent? For example, legal aid and financial support for people coming out of situations of abuse.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I could give a little bit of to just come back. We talked about it a little bit. Having legislation like the Domestic Workers Convention and the ILO protocol is one answer to a big problem that we need to go forward with, and it is very much connected. So for the system of change, it's a long cycle, and it's just one, and everybody in the system has to do their role of pushing it forward. So even if legislation passed of Domestic Workers Convention, the remedies and it actually impacting people and safeguarding it will take even a couple years before it really starts making real change. But till then, we need to have remedies that are in place. One thing that the forced labor protocol even touches on is making sure that there's compensation for victims. Just because they know the remedies of legislation and safeguarding them also takes a little bit of a while. So in regards to systemic change and legislation, it is from the top down, but it needs to also be built from the bottom up and has to work with one another. Rosa, I'll also leave it to you to expand on that.
Yes, I fully agree with you, Herrana, and I think that education is key. Education, awareness, training of starting from school, but of all people involved in the, for instance, in the legal system, in the judicial system. It's not because you are a judge that you have all the knowledge and you have no prejudice. You have to be trained specifically for certain matter. For instance, on violence, you have to know all, the mechanism of violence, of the victims, the reaction of victims, the traumatism the victims have. When I read, in judgment, yes, the victim contradicted herself. I mean, it means that you live in another world. I mean, have you never read how it functions psychologically? So I think that, for instance, judges, lawyers, all the people working in the area, social assistants, etc., should be trained to recognize what is trafficking, what is abuse, what is violence, how victims react, how you protect victims, how you not re-victimize victims. I was reading, there's been recently a case in Luxembourg of a woman, a Filipino woman, who made a complaint about abuse, exploitation at work, even trafficking. Okay, the first the first judgment was negative. There may be an appeal, but reading the articles in the press, you are astonished on how there is not yet the awareness of how you deal with these cases. It's the victim who has to justify herself for everything. So I think there is a long process. You need laws, but you need also the culture, to have a cultural change, to work on stereotypes. And as you said, on gender stereotypes, and when you have intersection of gender, race, and other elements of religion, then you have really a complex situation. And I don't think that we have all the tools to deal with this. And for instance, in Luxembourg, the Consultative Committee on Human Rights, they are the national rapporteur on human trafficking, and they did a second report last year, and it was amazing that all the cases where there's been a recognition that there was trafficking, a victim of trafficking, the sanction where there is impunity, Frank, at the end of the day. So you say all this for what? So there is a lot that must be done to implement and to really fulfill the objectives of these conventions, which are basically human rights, you know, for everybody, for domestic workers, for the victims, and for the domestic workers to have equal rights as all other kind of workers.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a couple of more. We've got a few more, but I can't answer them all. I'll try and answer another two. Another one, a sort of a topical issue around, do you think COVID-19 will lead to further exploitation of domestic workers? And if so, do you think there needs to be different actions? An example given was universal basic income to protect further exploitation.
You cut off a little bit, but it seemed the question was, would it be good for domestic workers to have universal income?
Yeah, the question was around during COVID-19, in order to give people the best protection during, well, one of the questions Tom had was, do you think COVID-19 will lead to a rise in domestic abuse of domestic workers? And the second was, part of that question was, do you think there's a role of universal basic income in supporting and protecting people in those situations?
I think it's really important to touch on that and to mention that for individuals during this pandemic, if you're not eligible for, you know, unemployment or any sorts of income, you are in a very tight situation financially to even get food on the table, to pay your rent, just, I mean, fundamental things to function. So that type of vulnerability will open you up to want to take non-formalized work or non-legal work, not because you want to, but you have no other choice. So having these types of universal income, whether it's in forms of, you know, unemployment or giving some sort of access so people will stay afloat, would be really, really important in order to make sure that these individuals are not being trafficked, and for survivors of trafficking being re-trafficked again back into the modern slavery system that we have.
Mm. I also think that the situation, the impact of the crisis will be high, you know, now we are still in the middle, in some countries more, or we are a little bit going out, you know, but the impact will be heavy on the economies, and we'll see it later. So I think we have to be very vigilant. I think there is already a lot of, you know, an increase in abuse. There are already some indicators of this. Of course, now the situation is quite confused because you don't have all the information, especially for persons who have no documents, you know, undocumented migrants. They are not visible. So how do you make statistics? So do you know what is the situation? But I think that we have to be very, very vigilant, because the impact in the medium and longer term will be quite heavy if there are not, you know, really tools to deal with this. And I don't know whether this maybe to have something basic that enables a person to have the minimum, a basis to live, you know, even without work. I think it would be helpful, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't have a clear solution.
The final question, which is quite general, but is a really important one, which is, for those that are tuning into this webinar, what are the key things they can do to try and help people who are in this situation? And yeah, what is the key actions they can take?
So we mentioned this a little bit earlier on the webinar, and two ways that you could be able to do that is signing both of our petitions. So we have the Domestic Workers Convention, which directly speaks about, the rights of domestic workers and having safeguards. But we also have the Forced Labor Protocol, which is another legislative body that could help not only domestic workers, but all forms of workers that are being exploited. So specifically for the Domestic Workers Convention, only 29 countries have ratified. So a vast majority of countries around the globe have not signed on and ratified this protocol to implement it with their own countries. So by joining our campaign, you'll be helping us get one step closer to making sure that our demands are stronger, our call to action. We'll be organizing with Rosa, with Times of Equality, to see how we could push this convention a little bit more in Europe as well, in Luxembourg, and even with the Forced Labor Protocol. So that's one way you could easily engage. We also have our COVID-19 brief on how it's been impacting our different campaigns. So you could take our action at our Stay Home Action Hub and take actions on our different campaigns that we're trying to tackle this issue currently.
Yes, I also agree that, taking part in campaigns with a simple, let's say, action like signing a petition are quite effective, because also you organize, for instance, what we did with Time for Equality when we started the campaign for the protocol. Actually, nearly nobody knew about the existence of the protocol. So at every event we had, we spoke about it, and then there was this clear, action to sign for the protocol. And another way of raising awareness for us, which we find very effective, is to raise awareness through films, through art, through films or other forms of art, which is a way for people to feel the empathy, to see, different stories. And then it's, as I said before many times, an eye-opener. You have sometimes people say, oh, well, I never thought that this could happen here, or I never thought, and you didn't know about it. Then you wonder how it's possible that you don't know when all this information is available now, but we have so much information maybe going. So I think we really have to use all ways to raise awareness, and we'll support the Domestic Workers Convention because only 7 countries in Europe signed it out of 27, which is really, a small part, And it's a way to talk people, to get more information, to think about, to reflect. And so I agree that it's a good way of, an action that everybody can do, without, and then you can choose. And I like this quote from the former Secretary General, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan: you can always do something according to who you are. So it means, okay, according to your role in society, if you are a member of parliament, or if you are a teacher, a parent, you can do something to change.
I love that quote. Well, Alan, are we good to wrap up now? Our Q&A. Well, Rosa, thank you so much for this great conversation that we were able to have, and we're so glad to be partnering with Times for Equality to push for the Domestic Workers Convention and the ILO Forced Labor Protocol. Thank you everybody for tuning in, for asking your questions. We apologize if we weren't able to answer, but if you would like, you could also send your questions at info@freedomunited.org, and we can respond from that portal as well. But thank you everyone. Thank you, Alan, as well, for joining us. Bye.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Rana. Thank you, everybody. Bye.